We are now going to move to the topic of this first plenary and focus on peace. And we're going to discuss Europe's role as a promoter and a guarantor of peace and stability within and beyond its borders. Unfortunately, Timothy Garton-Ash, some of you may be aware, couldn't be with us because his father, his very old father, is very seriously ill. He sent profuse apologies and very best wishes for the conference. But ladies and gentlemen, we have a fantastic panel to discuss this issue with us in a few moments. Jose Manuel Barroso, the European Commission President, said in a speech just last week that, and I quote, "The idea of peace is as compelling as ever in European integration." And he said that Ukraine was a stark reminder that it can never be taken for granted. So, what does the past tell us? What role is the EU playing now? What can we learn from the conflicts it is having to deal with, such as Ukraine, Syria, and conflicts within and on its borders now? And how do we see the challenge for the future? And as I said earlier, that crucial question, and the Deputy Minister alluded to it earlier, of the role of foundations, the things you can do. She highlighted in building trust as a crucial one. Are there other things also that you would highlight? Let me welcome our panel onto the stage. Our first panelist, and I'm not sure he's in the room, he couldn't fly in from Vienna last night. He was rushing from the airport. I'm told he is almost in the room, so if he isn't, he will join us on stage shortly, but let me introduce him anyway. Janusz Reiter, former Polish ambassador to Germany and the United States, and founder and chairman of the Center for International Relations in Poland, an independent think tank on foreign and security policy. As I say, Janusz is either in here or will join us in a couple of minutes. Looks like the latter. The others, if you could join me as I introduce you. Jordi Vaquer, Director of the Open Society Initiative for Europe. Jordi, very warm welcome to you. Avila Kilmurray, Director of the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland. Mirsad Budivatra, who is Director of the Sarajevo Film Festival. And Vesna Teršelić, who is founder and director of Documenta, the Center for Dealing with the Past, based in Croatia. And she's also, in 1998, Vesna was the winner of the Right Livelihood Award, known to many people as the Alternative Nobel Prize. Please do take a seat, make yourselves at home, relax, and we will launch in. I asked our speakers, ladies and gentlemen, very much not to make any sort of opening speeches, any presentations. We just want to have a good discussion, build on what we saw in the video and what we heard at the beginning. And Jordi, if I could turn to you first. And you know, this is a very particular year to be talking about peace, of course, because of the commemoration of World War I. And we are, as Ingrid was saying, in a city very much scarred by conflict, but also a city that shows us what can be done and what is being done. At this point, how do you see Europe's role as a guarantor of peace and stability? And what for you are the most important challenges as we look to the future?
Well, I have changed my view about this role in the last 2 years, and let me tell you how, because I think it's interesting. When the EU got the Nobel Peace Prize, I thought it was a good thing, because I thought that would be the final point to a narrative that no longer engaged most of the Europeans. Most of us have not experienced war, and to just think of it as constantly of Europe as a state of non-war only was not appealing. Europe was losing its appeal, and I thought, good thing, Nobel Peace Prize, we can forget about this, think about something else. Not only Ukraine proved me very wrong, but in fact, on Monday, Pew, the polling firm, issued a survey of a large sample of citizens of 7 EU member states. And it came very clear that Europeans still see very much these as one of the fundamental reasons for the EU to exist. And while the political discourse has moved on into other areas, logically, over 70% of the Europeans still see that this is the fundamental role of the EU. So don't take it from me. I got it wrong. Take it from 70% of people who think that's wrong. And in terms of challenges, you were asking me. Now, of course, there's many, but I would say 3 at least are very complex. One is to talk peace to a generation that does not conceive war is not easy. And my generation and younger generations to simply not conceive of war. Even in the Balkans, the younger generations some of them have almost forgotten. At least how it started, not how it was, but where it came from. Secondly, how can Europe be a herbivore amongst carnivores, as it were, in the international scene? And you know, we're seeing it in the Ukraine every day. And finally, how can we re-engage these fantastic energies in the streets, in the internet, in protests, in activism? How can we re-engage them with the core of the European project, which is unity? There are people who think transnationally, but that don't necessarily think European.
Sure. So really echoing what Eric was saying, when you talk about rethinking Europe and building the trust, you see the peace element, that pole, and the challenges we face as really core to that. Avila, what for you? Europe's role now, we saw Belfast, Northern Ireland was in that film, very powerful images there. What for you has been the role of Europe in terms of the peace process in Northern Ireland? And how do you see the challenges for it, both in terms of conflicts within its own borders and more broadly?
Europe's role has been amazingly important in terms of Northern Ireland, not only since the ceasefires in 1994 and the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, but actually during the conflict. But it actually managed to achieve that role in a very subtle manner. Because Europe, and I think it's one of the things that Europe has lost, Europe at that stage played very much on Europe of the regions. And that gave us the creativity to be able to talk about issues within the Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, in such a way that it wasn't upsetting member states. And I think one of the things that we actually have lost in Europe, and is one of the challenges, is that subtlety. The other, and it's not just European, but I think an international challenge that we have lost, is the creative ambiguity of the non-aligned state. My sense is that since 9/11, the world, not just Europe, but certainly within Europe, has moved from talking about what the Council of Europe used to talk about, a culture of peace, into defence and security. And I think that is a massive leap, and it's very dangerous. And I think we can see it now in terms of some of the policy statements that are coming out of European think tanks and out of NATO. And if we don't recognise that shift and what that narrative is doing to us, then I think we're in trouble. In terms of what Europe has done since the ceasefire, since the agreement, again, that has been very important in terms of the peace programmes that Europe put in from the world, and it was Jacques Delors. Yeah. Even before the agreement, he says, I want to consolidate this peace process and put in a very important programme of support. And that allowed foundations like my own to go out and fund all the political ex-prisoner groups and the victims of violence. We couldn't have done that with the Irish and British government or local, but we could with Europe. And that was very important. But my last point in this, the policies of Europe very often are brilliant. There's a disconnect in how they're implemented in terms of the experience on the ground. And that, I think, is a challenge.
So that's something that will need to be addressed. And you talked there about money, and money has been important to fund these things. And Mirsad, for you, I mentioned Sarajevo Film Festival. I know money is a big issue. You now come under the media programme. You get some EU money. But more broadly, the festival was started, I think, during the siege of Sarajevo, a remarkable thing to have done in 1995. How have you seen over the years the role of the EU in terms of the conflict on your own doorstep and more broadly? And what for you are the challenges? You were listening to the Minister earlier. Any reflections on what she said?
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank to all people who came to Sarajevo. I think it's, from my point of view, we have to be very thankful, I think, to all people who establish foundations and who reserve funds to create better world, to create better societies. And from my point, who spent 4 years in Sarajevo during the siege, I think I have a right. You asked me several questions, and maybe I will go very briefly, one by one. I think that the role of the foundations was fantastic during the war. Not only humanitarian, but also work on basic values we needed during the war. And that's one of the reasons why Sarajevo, I think, survived as heroic city. And for us, the role of the Europe was very unclear, even until now. I think that we had some of the countries, or let's say politics from some countries, very supportive to solve the problem of the conflict during the war. But unfortunately, I'm not going to mention who was on one or the other side now. It's already 20 years ago. But we had also several countries, or their politicians, not ready to solve the problem. That's the problem of Europe. Even now, I think that we have two processes, how we feel from Sarajevo. We have a process of integration, and we have a process of disintegration. Even now, having Ukraine case, we can see what kind of the role Europe could have. There are so many statements, but unfortunately, as we suffered for 4 years, now we have, even from those films, there are so many places in the world where people and ordinary people are suffering. And that's maybe the view that Europe still for us is a little bit unclear, what the Europe is today. And I think we are missing strong Europe and unity of European countries.
So it needs to remind people what it's about, what it's for, and be very clear in its vision. We talk a lot about Europe speaking with one voice. The perception from those right on its doorstep and hoping to join is often it is a bit not like our beautiful choir, but more of a cacophony. Vesna, if I could ask you the same question, and also if you could react a little bit to what you saw in the film, because this is your area of expertise. You have worked your enormous expertise on reconciliation, fostering the sort of things that film and those other projects are developing. Europe's role for you in all of this?
Europe is far from speaking with one voice. I do not want to say that we should hope that Europe would speak with one voice, as it was expressed in the past, but I believe that different voices could reach synchronicity in relating to violence. So when European Union got that Nobel Prize, there was an exhibition staged outside of European Parliament in Brussels, which have started with photos from Auschwitz. And then from Auschwitz on, all the violent scenes from European past have been shown. And I was standing there and looking at this question which Europe actually refuses to take on. You see, it's that Europe is a very successful peace project, especially European Union, and sees itself as a union overcoming the violence of Second World War. But that's not quite true, especially not in post-Yugoslav countries. So it's that I believe that it's very important to find the ways to help each other to face violence, to deal with what is there, what is left, what remains, sometimes through judicial mechanisms, sometimes through truth-telling, in a form of truth commissions or theater or film or other creative ways to eventually acknowledge that crimes have been committed, that violence was done, and that suffering is still there. Because for survivors, acknowledgement is very important. But also because of right of new generations to learn history based on facts. And the last sentence of wonderful Michael Lezak's summary of what was done in different countries was that eventually it shouldn't happen to no one human being to simply disappear. It's responsibility which is there to document what happened, to remember the name and circumstances in which this human being have been either killed or is still missing. And it is that eventually that suffering which have not been dealt with, it somehow freezes creativity. I see it every day. I see it in Zagreb, I see it in Sarajevo, I see it in all the places where actually there is unacknowledged suffering. And as we look back to First World War, there are no contemporaries living, but there are living contemporaries of Second World War, and here we face 3 layers of violence, living violence. Second World War, living through Yugoslav socialism and political violence, and wars of the 90s. And we need to find a way to integrate that and to build a bridge between past through what we do today economically and creatively, and eventually find a way to face a past but eventually liberate creativity.
Thank you. So I'm very much linking. Mirsad, I will bring you in later, but I want to welcome on stage now, all the way from Vienna via a very tortuous route, Janusz Reuter. Janusz, thank you so much for being here. Please, if you sit next to Vesna, make yourself comfortable. And Janusz, as I say, I already introduced you, explained who you were, and thank you so much. I know it's been very torturous to get here. We're delighted to have you. We have just started the discussion, Janusz, and I was asking really, we've seen a video this morning, the Truth in Translation project about reconciliation. We've talked already a lot about the creativity and the imagination required to address these issues. And I'm hearing from the panel so far when it comes to Europe's role, some feeling that Europe is not quite stepping up to the plate in the way that it itself thinks it is sometimes, that it has done a lot of good, that it can do a lot of good in terms of fostering peace and stability, but some misgivings and therefore some need to rethink it. Your first thoughts on Europe's role now and the challenges as you see them?
Well, thank you very much. First, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure that I'm going to enjoy for 35 minutes, and it's really a pleasure, and because for these 35 minutes I have spent now 23 hours, and I'm going to spend another 8 hours traveling forth and back. But it's a pleasure, and I'm going to enjoy it.
We have redefined pleasure.
And you know,
for you.
I really believe that much closer to the world's realities than many places in Western Europe. And I believe it is the right time to face the realities. Not only the realities of the European Union, but the realities of Europe, which is more than the European Union, and the realities of the world. First, people in the EU tend often to say, war is impossible in Europe. This is not true. War is maybe within the European Union. It is unfortunately possible in Europe. Bosnia, the former Yugoslavia, is part of Europe. Ukraine is part of Europe. We are facing the reality that war, which has never ceased to be part of the global reality, is now getting closer also to the borders of the European Union. And we are somehow helpless in dealing that. Because I think now two basic assumptions of the European Union are under pressure. The first assumption was that there is the clear perspective, the clear prospect of prosperity. And also part of that was the cohesion within the societies, but also between the member states. Today, we have social tensions in a lot of societies, and we have a lot of tensions between member states, because some of them are very successful, and some feel that they fail. The other assumption was that we give up parts of our sovereignty, but we get in return the guarantee that peace will be there forever in Europe. But suddenly, well, people in the eastern part of the European Union feel that this is fragile. And they ask themselves, can we rely on this promise? If at the same time these two promises are questioned or are challenged, that creates a new mood in the European Union. And then we also have another crisis that I would like to remind you of. In the south, the so-called migration crisis, which is a human, which is a moral crisis, also a political crisis. We have in the east, in Ukraine, millions of people who want to share the European dream because they still believe in that. And we have people in the south, in Africa, who want even a small share in this European dream, and we say to them, no, there is no place for you. I don't believe that we can be successful in this with this approach. We have to reach out to the outside world to solve the European problems. The European project was based also on the absence in global affairs. That must change. Europe has to defend itself not on the borders, but in our neighborhoods, in the south and in the east. And, well, we have also to, I would say, to impress ourselves in order to impress other people in the world. And there are some signs in Poland, in Germany, and some other countries that people are somehow returning to this promise of peace as an important motivation for the Europeans to stay together.
Thank you. And Ms. Sad, if I could come back on when you said the EU wasn't very clear, we're going to be talking, you mentioned cohesion, we're going to talk about that in our panel on Saturday, but tomorrow we're going to talk about the European elections, and you talk about a clear vision, and what we are expecting, if all the polls are right, is a huge rise in populism. We are already seeing that having an impact on the enlargement debate. Two of our candidates, the two leading candidates for Commission President, Martin Schulz and Jean-Claude Juncker, both said in a televised debate this week they didn't see any prospect of enlargement. Schulz said for the foreseeable future. Juncker said not in the next 5 years. And what impact could that have? The link between these things in terms of the way Europe is perceived and the role it can play in peace and stability. If you lose your integration perspective.
Question, before I'm going to this question, to answer on this question, I would like to say something what I didn't answer on your previous question regarding the speech of our Deputy Minister, Mr. Illich. And I would like to say that we know that there is no progress without collaboration with politicians. And Deputy Minister Sarajevo is expecting so many complaints. But I have to say that our hope is to have more people as Mr. Illich, because she's a new generation, I think, of politicians in Bosnia and hopefully in the region. Because, as you mentioned, media participation of Bosnia was on hold almost 5 years. And then, with our Deputy Minister, Mr. Illich, she took this project, and only in, I would say, 3 or 4 months, she found all hidden papers in the drawers of bureaucracy, and she solved the problem, which was for 5 years held as not possible to be solved. And hopefully that the other parts of the Bosnia will have also the people as Ms. Sarajevo, because Bosnia is, due to Dayton Agreement, completely divided country in 3 areas. And that means, what means to be the part of the Europe? If there is no extra countries in the 5 or 6 years. I think we have to work on ourselves, and then Europe will come and ask us to be the part of the Europe.
But Vesna, does it also affect the EU's role as a promoter and guarantor of peace and stability? Because the lure of membership, the soft power of the hope that one day you will join, has been a big factor for many societies across the Balkans in driving the process of change that's needed. How big an impact do you think it would have on Europe's role if we do see a freeze for the foreseeable future?
It would have enormous impact if this period would be shortened, because closing the door and saying, well, 5 years, nothing, that's surely not inspiring. And I do believe that Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia and Macedonia do need that kind of inspiration. It was very inspirational for Croatia. It was a very difficult negotiation process, but integration process set very clear goals, and gradually governmental departments became ready to meet that goals one by one. And I would really hope that European Union should make additional effort, especially here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because I would say there are all depths of bad policy steps which are still there and oblige more.
Jordi, just please pick up on those things, but I want to move the discussion on a bit because we don't have long, and I'm trying to find some time to come out to all of you. In terms of rethinking Europe, we've heard some suggestions already about what has worked well, what is less effective. For you, when we look at this issue of our role in the world and our role in peace and stability, do you think Europe needs rethinking, or is it a matter of tweaking, using the tools we've got better, learning from our experiences more than we perhaps have, or is it something more radical that's needed?
Well, I think it's I think a lot of people, very clever people, have thought about Europe and its role in the world for a long, long time. And they left behind really important issues. And they had to do with the bottom-up view of things. And enlargement, for example, looked very different when looked from not just Brussels, but even Belgrade's administrative buildings or Zagreb's administrative buildings, and when looked from if you were working in a factory that was going to be closed and nothing was there for you out there. So I don't think thinking a lot more, we've got many clever people in Europe, and they've done it for many times, for a long, long time. And I've been part of the think tank scene, and I've been part of it. I think that isn't enough. And in particular, there is a young generation saying we don't want the original, you were mentioning the original spirit of Europe. There's something very nice in the original spirit of Europe. There's something about 60-year-old men from almost aristocratic origin sitting in a closed room, deciding for us all that we should not go back to. And there is an appetite for rethinking it differently. So yes, let's rethink, but let's not go back to the old thinking habits that actually missed so much of the picture.
And Avila, if I can bring another element in, but please react to what you've heard. I was very struck. You used the word about the European Union's role in the Irish peace processes. You said they did it with subtlety. And I wondered what you meant by that, and I wonder whether there are lessons in that for what the EU, or Europe more broadly, should and shouldn't do in the face of current conflicts. And I want to come back to this in the last part of this discussion, in terms of what the foundations can and couldn't do. What did you mean by subtlety, and why is that so important?
What I meant by subtlety was that they were dealing certainly with an internal crisis in a member state, which has always been quite difficult for Europe, particularly as they have moved towards the principle of subsidiarity in terms of the importance of the member state having control, if you like, of decisions. So by using the idea of Europe at the regions, they were actually able to circumvent that without alienating the UK, or indeed the Irish government, as the case may be. So it was actually using a concept that was there to take up a regional issue in a progressive manner. But I do want to come back on just a couple of points. First of all, I think the vision, if you like, of Europe as peace and prosperity cannot be at the sake of protectionism. Because actually, when we look at Europe, Europe's historical prosperity has largely been based on exploiting the rest of the world. So I think that Europe actually has a duty to look outwards as well. And I think it's unrealistic, being sort of a realpolitik, at the moment to talk about a unity of Europe, either in terms of voice or in terms of territory. I mean, we're facing the Scottish referendum. There's the situation that the Catalonians are looking for a referendum. So actually, now is not the time to be talking about geographic or territorial unity. But the important unity that I would like to see is a certain basic agreement around principles, cross-cutting principles around human rights, around women's rights, around the rights of immigrants coming in, around the rights of the Roma community. And Europe has to model that, not just to preach about it to other people.
Okay, thank you. Janusz, reaction to that, if you would, but also in terms of this broader question, is it rethinking? Is it a fundamental rethink, or is it, as Georgie said, almost, we now have to get on with the doing, and there's been a lot of thinking. Now, we have to act and we have to look for new ways of responding to the challenges that we face. What do you think? And then I'm going to come out and take some brief comments from the audience.
I don't believe that this is a crisis that can be addressed in a technocratic way. I believe that a part of the problem is that the European institutions have been very good at, I would say, at this technocratic approach. Yeah. The European Commission is a sort of institutionalized rationality. But unfortunately, the emotional side has been left to the nation states. And today, we have a wide gap between the emotions that are handled by the nation states and the rationality that is represented and managed by the European Commission. And we don't know how to bridge this gap, but we have to do so. And let me make one remark, because I think it's important to understand the relationship between the European Union and the nation states. The nation states are inevitable for the success of the European Union. It is one of the biggest illusions that you can jump over the nation state to be a successful European. That, unfortunately, does not work. You may use the European Union to fix your nation state, but you cannot replace the nation state by a sort of European identity.
So we may not, Europe may not need to rethink itself, but Brussels sometimes perhaps does, if I can infer. Can we have the lights up a tiny little bit, if it's possible, just so I can see? Is there anybody who would like to come in with a brief comment or question? And it is impossible to get to people, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you if you can pass that back, reach over the divide. We're talking about collaborating, cooperating. Please introduce yourself and please be very brief. We don't have long.
Yeah, definitely. I know how painful can be people who speak
think
from
that
public.
mic is-
You know, participation is always difficult. My name is Haki Abazi, and I'm from Kosovo. I work for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. So I just wanted to add that, yes, both Kosovo and Albania need that message of encouragement from European Union too. I think it's a historical moment to rethink Europe, not from political sense, but also from geographic sense, even though I understand that we cannot build walls to prevent the refugees to come. Actually, Europeans should be the one leading the world on the liberal view. So, but my question to the panel, through a comment, would be, are you surprised the way Europe is surprised with what's happening in Ukraine after being silent and hiding in Chechnya, in Syria, in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and elsewhere?
Thank you very much. And if Europe is surprised, should it be surprised? Sorry, if you could just ask you, thank you very much indeed. Any other comments or questions before we come back? Hang on a second, let me just come round. Thank you very much. It's all right, no, don't use those, use this one if you would, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Yevgen Bystritsky. I represent the foundation from Ukraine, Ukrainian Foundation, International Renaissance Foundation. My question is very simple. After your presentations, what do you think? Is it proportional support assistance from the side of Europe, European Union, to Ukraine as you know, this is as a subject of aggression of Russia?
So are we doing enough?
And I would like to say that we understand in Ukraine how it is difficult for countries of European Union to find out a kind of balanced approach to this situation. Why? Because there are a lot of the economic business ties between European countries and Russia. And at the same time, do you think that the sanctions proposed doing by European countries is or are the right answer to the situation?
Okay. I should also point out, I mean, many of these issues, we're going to have a very distinguished professor from Ukraine joining us for the closing plenary. We're going to talk about solidarity and obviously economic, financial solidarity as well as political solidarity. So many of these issues will come back. But if I can broaden the question really into, are you surprised? And also, what do you think the implications are for the EU? Any last one, quick one, if there is, or shall we go back to the panel? I see one over here, so let me take that, and I'll grab a quick one there as well. Very brief, if you could, so I can squeeze in this
Good afternoon, my name is Leila. I'm from Mosaic Foundation. I have a question for all panelists. The question would be, what kind of Europe do you hope to see in 15 years? Thank you.
Good one. Not one to answer quickly, but a very good question. And where was the last one, I promised? There we are, sir. Thank you.
Marco De Maria, Compagnia di San Paolo, Italy. I was wondering if the role of peace guarantor you mentioned of Europe shouldn't imply the birth of a European military as one of the first steps, because we cannot have any kind of international outreach in the field of peacekeeping if we hadn't a common armed force.
Thank you. Okay, let us come back. Quite diverse questions, and we don't have long, and I do want to ask you about the role of foundations. So perhaps if I could ask you just to pick up on one of them that you feel most relevant. Who would like to kick us off? Perhaps, Janusz, in terms of, and Jordi first, in terms of the impact of Ukraine, were we taken by surprise? And if we were, should we have been? And how do you see its implications? It was suggested by an MEP just before they broke for the elections that Putin should get the St. Charlemagne Prize for contributions to European unity. But a suggestion there from the gentleman that has our response been adequate? How do you see it?
The Ukraine crisis is a challenge to both our values and our interests. And so this is even more difficult to deal with than some crisis in other continents, because then we may say, okay, this is against our values, but well, we have limited power. This is very much our interests. The European Union is, per nature, tends to be very conservative. I remember in 1990, when Germany was unified, many people, also in the US, considered that finished job. We said, no, no, come on, there is more to do in Europe. We need to enlarge NATO and the European Union. Then we had the NATO and the EU enlargement, and then many people said, now it's really finished business. And we said, no, it's not finished, because the transformation in the post-Soviet space has not been accomplished. But this is what many people in Europe just did not want to hear. And then we were reminded of that by people in Ukraine. And this could be perceived in Europe as a big triumph of the European idea. But instead of taking that as a triumph, we were embarrassed by that, because we didn't know how to respond to that, because we feel that European Union is too weak. And the right response to the crisis is we have to make the European Union strong, politically, but also in terms of defense.
Okay, so you would echo what was said. Jordi, we need a European military?
Well, this one. I was hoping Ukraine, which is the easy one. Let me first go to Ukraine. I think we were taken by surprise by events in Ukraine, all of us. But some of the things that happened are not surprising in hindsight. The one thing I find extraordinarily surprising is Euromaidan. It's not that Yanukovych did not sign, and it's not that Putin would use any resource to stop Ukraine from going completely to the European side. It's what happened in between. It's a founding moment of a new Ukrainian nation. I think that is not something many of us expected. Okay. And I think that is the big news in Ukraine. Not just, that Putin is ready to do anything. We saw that in South Ossetia and in other places. And should the response to this be for the, put together the European Union defense budgets are much larger than that of Russia and are the second largest after the US. So should the response be to rearm and have a lot more weapons? Probably not. Should the response be to wave a blue flag with stars instead of the national flags? Maybe. But I don't think the problem that we have is of basically now is of capacities. It's of, the European Union in its DNA doesn't think the use of force is generally a solution to things. And because there's already NATO, perhaps that's a good thing that that's not what the EU tends to do. Okay, I want to ask two questions by way of wrapping this discussion up. One is Leila's. I'd like to come down the line first and ask each of you, this is really mean, but Leila did it, not me. If you had to, in a sentence, describe how you see Europe, I think her time frame was 15 years. What is your vision of Europe 15 years from now? And if you could, please relate it specifically to its role in the world, its role in terms of peace and stability. Let us do that first, and then I would like you, after that, we'll go down the line again, and I would like you to give this room some advice. As European foundations meet and they discuss, and as Ingrid said, look for ways, and as Eric said, to respond to these challenges, if you had to give them a recommendation for action, something they should do, whether on their own or working with other foundations or working with governments or other civil society actors, what would you suggest they do? But let us first do your vision of Europe. I should say, I'll start with the easy one. Neither are easy. I'm starting with the harder one. Avila, for you, your vision of Europe 15 years from now in terms of its role in peace and stability.
Okay, but just before that, could I just go back to your previous one? And I think actually Ukraine is fascinating. It's not just Ukraine, actually. It's also North Africa. I think what we've seen are very basic questions about what is civic activism? Very often it's urban-centred, quite narrow. You know, we have a sense that it's always progressive, not necessarily. And what is democracy? We know that in Ireland, it was where you drew the line in 1920, and we suffer from it ever since. Okay. So those questions. In terms of my vision, I think, for Europe in 15 years' time is a Europe that will have respect for diversity and will have an open relationship with other countries. And I would really like to see an engagement with the question of Turkey in Europe.
Okay, thank you. Geordie?
I will use the same word, open. And open means open to the immediate, the near abroad, the enlargement countries, but also to the immediate neighbors, but also internally open society. Europe is closing down. I think we are in the middle of the fight, whether Europe will be an open place or a closed one. My vision is of an open Europe.
Okay. Mirsad, for you, you expressed some dissatisfaction with its role now. What's your vision of its role, the role it can and should play?
For me, it's very difficult to say what's the vision. I would rather say what's the reality, I think.
Right. But, what do you think the reality will be in 15 years' time?
The reality is maybe that the process with the Soviet Union is going to be finished. I think it's some kind of the problem is going to exist in several years more. That's how we can see from Sarajevo, because we had the 4 years process here, and it's not yet finished.
So confronting this new reality.
I hope that the process of the creating civil society is going to be stronger and stronger, including Ukraine, Russia, and all other.
Which I think will link to my question about foundations.
Hopefully that's the future of Europe. Let's create civil society as fast as we can.
Thank you. Vesna?
I see inclusive Europe with managed xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, with clear awareness that they're there and have to be managed, and that if there is violence, and there is violence all the time, we should take position towards it without military, because I believe in trust-building process and soft power of Europe. It is that more military and new forms of it do not mean more sustainable peace.
Thank you. Janusz?
We cannot isolate ourselves from our neighborhood. We need our neighborhood, we need our neighbors, those in the south, in Africa. Africa is offering resources and a lot of human capital. This is something European desperately needs. We need our neighbors in the east, because these are societies that are willing to share our dreams, our values, and we also need them for security. If we succeed with that, then we may one day be able to return to the vision of a European security space that also includes Russia. I hope that will one day also be possible again.
Okay, and again in a sentence, because that's all we have time for, your recommendation, one thing you think European foundations should do to contribute as much as they can to tackling conflicts, preventing them, to fostering reconciliation.
Well, being faster before the political institutions get there. And I'm afraid there will be a race against time in many areas. In Eastern Europe, but also in Africa. Also go Africa. Africa is undervalued in Europe. And before we get in a crisis, we should be there.
Vesna, what would you like them to do?
Ensure right to truth, right to justice, and ensure that there's remembrance of every human being who was killed or is still missing, and making sure that new generations have a right to learn history based on facts.
Thank you. Mirsad?
Okay, I feel a little bit as at Oscar ceremony. I have 60 seconds to say something.
I'm sorry, it is the constraints of an opening plenary, and I never like to keep an audience from their lunch, so that's why time pressure is all.
No, what I would recommend or say about work of foundations, to discover, to support local people, to walk on the ground, not just to give the statements. Let's work hard on the ground. And I think cooperation with local partners is essential. I think that we have always grow from the
bottom up.
Yes.
Yes.
And I hope that all foundations from all around the Europe of the world will find good local people, if not discover already ready, then educate them and with them to create new society based on true democratic values.
Well, I think you should be at the Oscar ceremony because that was magnificent. Jordi.
Even the good processes, even peace as opposed to war, has losers. I think we have not done a very good job of listening to the voices and empowering the voices of losers of transitions, from the Greek, Portuguese and Spanish transition to democracy all the way to Central and Eastern European transitions and post-war transitions. And I think the losers are now coming back and surprising us in very unpleasant ways.
Thank you. Avila, you have the last word.
I agree with that. And I think there's also, to create space for the discordant voices that actually question the accepted norms. Too often we take a common sense approach. We need to actually listen to others that question that approach.
Okay, and on that, ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our panel very much indeed? Thank you so much. We will return to some of the issues we've discussed, as I mentioned, tomorrow when we talk about political governance, and we will talk about that public perception and so on. We will return on Saturday to the question of solidarity, that cohesion between member states, within societies, and indeed with those on our doorstep who need our help. So we're going to come back on a lot of that. But thank you. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground in a very short time. Thank you to you all, and may I invite you to return to your seats. Thank you again so much. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, we were going to hear from another choir, a very special choir called Supera Children's Choirs, who come from Srebrenica. And although we're not going to hear from them, unfortunately, because of the weather, they actually got stuck, could not get across a bridge, and could not make it. They set out this morning at 6 o'clock, but had to turn back. But it is a remarkable musical initiative committed to fostering equal opportunities, respectful intercultural relations, and social integration, and using the power of music, arts, and culture to inspire courage, confidence, and hope for the future. They couldn't be with us, but so inspirational in terms of giving us hope for the future, confidence, all those words, are indeed the Pont Anima Choir. So it is my pleasure to invite them to close proceedings for us. Choir, over to you. Thank you very much indeed again to the Pont Anima Choir for setting proceedings off so very movingly. Thank you all very much indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, that brings our opening plenary to a close. I would just like to thank our opening speakers again very much for setting some inspiration and some challenges for our discussion. I'd like to thank our panel. I'd like to thank Michael Lessig again for the splendid film. Big thank you to the choir, and thank you to all of you for coming. Lunch will be served back at the hotel from now, and the concurrent sessions, if you're attending any of those, they're in the university building, which is halfway between here and there, and they begin at 2:30, so in 1 hour. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the next 3 days. I look forward to seeing you back here for the 2 plenaries, but please, I hope you have very fruitful discussions and many useful networking opportunities.